He lost his wife. He lost his daughter. And for 3 years he lived in silence, until 4 abandoned children showed up at his door in the pouring rain. One of them looked up at him and whispered, "Can you be our dad? Just for tonight?" What happened next changed everything he thought he knew about love, family, and second chances. If you believe that even the most broken hearts can find their way home again, tap like and subscribe. There are more stories waiting, and you won't want to miss the next one. Jack Mason didn't believe in signs anymore. There was a time he used to, when his wife would nudge him in church pews, whispering that the light through stained glass looked like angels descending. Or when their daughter Sophie used to laugh at cardinals landing on the windowsill, calling them little miracles with feathers. But that was 3 winters ago, before the chemo, before the sirens, before the fire station let him go because a man who couldn't save his own family had no place saving others. Now Jack believed in one thing only: silence. The kind that filled his old house at the edge of Willow Hollow, where the pine trees stood like quiet witnesses and the wind made no promises. That evening, as rain needled the tin roof and wind leaned hard against the eaves, Jack stepped onto the back porch to tie down the tarp on the firewood. The storm had come fast, cold, sharp, insistent, just like grief. He tightened the rope around the last stack when someone moved in his periphery. A small shift of shape. In the darkness, Jack's breath hitched. He narrowed his eyes into the rain. Under the far corner of the porch roof, almost pressed into the siding, stood a girl. Thin, soaked, holding the hand of a smaller child, who leaned heavily against her side. Behind them, 2 more figures huddled, together. 4. Jack froze. The girl didn't speak, just stared at him, wide-eyed and unblinking. Her lips were blue at the edges. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she said at last, her voice barely more than the rain. We didn't know where else to go. Can we sit under here for a little while?" Jack glanced from the girl to the little ones behind her, a boy with knobby knees and wet socks, a younger girl with tangled red curls, and the smallest, a boy no older than 4, whose arms clung limply around her neck. Jack opened his mouth, then closed it. He could hear his heart, not in a poetic way, literally. The thud of it in his ears warning him. He didn't want this. He didn't want to remember what it was like to hold a child, to protect something fragile. He didn't want to see that girl's face and think of Sophie's coat still, hanging in the hallway untouched for years. But they were shivering. And God help him, he still had enough decency to care. "Come inside," he said gruffly, pushing the door open with one arm. "I've got a fire going." The warmth of the kitchen hit them like a wall. The lights cast a soft amber glow over the worn oak table, the tiled counters, the kettle steaming on the stove. Jack handed out towels wordlessly, poured milk into mugs, and rummaged for the last of the soup he'd made 2 nights ago. The girl helped the others out of their wet clothes, moving with a kind of practiced grace that spoke of necessity, not comfort. They didn't ask questions. Neither did he. Only when the soup was warmed and served and the kids sat hunched around the table did he allow himself to really look at them. The girl, maybe 10, her name unknown, her shoulders too straight for her age. The boy beside her, older than the rest, chewed like he hadn't eaten in days. His eyes stayed on the floor. The red-headed girl barely touched her food, instead fingering a plastic bracelet with faded pink beads. And the little one, the baby boy, curled into himself on the bench, half asleep but still holding the girl's hand with quiet desperation. Jack cleared his throat. "You got names?" The girl paused, then nodded. "Maggie," she said. "This is Thomas, Lily, and Joey." Jack nodded, repeating the names silently. Names made things real. Names made them harder to send away. Later, when the storm slowed and the fire burned low, Jack watched as Joey, the youngest, began to slump forward, heavy with sleep. Maggie steadied him with one arm and met Jack's gaze. Her voice was so quiet, he almost didn't hear her. "Can you be our dad?" she asked. Jack's hands stilled. "Just for tonight," she added, almost apologetically. "We'll be real quiet, we don't want to sleep scared again." Jack couldn't speak, couldn't move. His mind screamed at him, "This is not your burden. This is not your second chance. Don't confuse kindness with commitment." But in his chest something stirred, something not dead, just buried. He didn't answer. Instead, he gently took the blanket from the back of the couch, draped it over the children where they lay like a tangle of hope and exhaustion, and turned off the kitchen light. The porch was slick with rain. Jack stood there a long time, staring into the dark, hands in his pockets, breath slow and tight. He looked toward the old patch of dirt near the back fence, the place where Sophie used to play, where her swing had once hung. The ground there had been bare for years. Nothing planted, nothing grown. Until now he hadn't noticed how lonely it looked. Behind him, the sound of small breaths, soft and steady, reached out like a thread. They weren't his, but they were here. And maybe that was enough for tonight. Jack stepped back inside, locked the door, and let the warmth hold him, if only a little. Jack didn't sleep that night. He lay on the worn leather couch with a throw blanket across his chest, one arm folded behind his head, staring up at the ceiling like it might answer the question that had been clawing at him since the moment Maggie spoke. "Can you be our dad?" The words had nestled into the silence of the house like seeds in soft soil. Simple, weightless at first, but beginning to root in places Jack had kept fallow for years. Outside, the wind had calmed. Rain tapped only now and then at the windows, like it too had exhausted itself. But inside Jack's mind, everything churned. In the morning, he found them still asleep around the kitchen table. Maggie's arms encircled Joey. Thomas was curled up with his head on his arms. Lily had made a pillow out of her sweater, her face turned toward the old bread box. Jack stood there for a long moment, studying them. How still they were, how familiar the silence had become with them in it. He should call someone. This isn't his problem. He didn't ask for this. He turned away, made coffee, burned the toast. Later, after they woke and ate, quietly he handed Maggie a clean towel and gestured toward the bathroom. "You first," he said. She hesitated. "You sure?" "It's got hot water if that helps." She looked like she might cry, but didn't. She nodded instead. When she disappeared behind the door, Jack turned to the others. "You three sit tight, no funny business." Thomas gave the faintest nod. Lily offered a tiny smile. Joey just blinked at him, big eyes, rimmed red. When Maggie came out, damp hair tucked behind her ears, something about her looked different. Lighter, maybe, still wary, but softened. She held a bundle of dirty clothes in her arms. Jack took them without a word and dropped them into the washing machine, then started it. It surprised him how easy that was. The act of helping, like he'd never stopped knowing how. Around noon, Jack pulled on his coat and gestured for Maggie to follow. "Where are we going?" she asked, adjusting Joey on her hip. "Just to town. You kids need some proper clothes, and I need answers." She hesitated. "We don't have money. I didn't ask if you did." He didn't say it kindly, but he didn't say it mean either, just plainly, like this was something that had to happen, like sweeping the porch or fixing a fence post. They climbed into his truck, the old Chevy, grumbling awake as they rolled down the gravel drive. The main street of Willow Hollow looked like something from a postcard. White steepled church, red brick general store, sidewalks still slick from last night's storm. A few townsfolk nodded. As Jack passed, curiosity flickering in their eyes. At the thrift store, Jack handed Maggie a 20 from his wallet. "You know sizes?" "For them, yeah. I'll figure something for me." He watched as she moved through the racks, efficient, almost clinical. She picked plain shirts, sturdy jeans, a soft pink hoodie for Lily. She found a coat for Thomas, gloves for Joey. No toys, no nonsense. She was a little soldier. It broke his heart. Back at the truck with bags in the back seat and silence thick between them, Jack finally asked, "So, where are your parents?" She didn't answer right away. Then, Dad died last year. Truck accident. Jack said nothing. She continued staring out the window. We lived with our stepmom after that. She didn't want us. Said we were too much. Last night she pulled over on the highway and told us to get out. Drove away before I even got Joey out of the car seat. Jack gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he didn't. That night, after dinner, canned beans and biscuits Maggie helped warm up, Jack stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a pot, with more force than necessary. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing the scar that twisted along the inside of his forearm, the pale reminder of the fire he couldn't beat. He caught Maggie looking. She didn't ask. But she said quietly, "You got burned?" "Yeah," he muttered. "In a fire?" "Yeah." He waited for the questions, the curiosity, the judgment. But she just said, "Must have hurt bad." Jack stared at her. "It did," he admitted. She nodded. "Still does?" Sometimes, he wanted to say, but instead he reached for the dish towel. "Go check on your brothers and sister." Maggie turned and padded into the living room. He watched her go, then turned off the kitchen light. That night, lying in bed again, Jack stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet, not empty, but resting, breathing. He thought about the scar on his arm, about the one on his chest no one could see. He thought about that little voice just last night asking him to be a father for a single night, just tonight. But tonight had become another morning, and another trip into town, and a pot of beans shared at the table. What happens tomorrow? He didn't know, but for now they were still here, still warm, still breathing. So was he. And somehow that was enough. The third morning came quietly, the kind of morning Jack used to savor before everything went wrong. Mist clung low to the ground. Sunlight crept in through the kitchen window like it was still deciding if it wanted to commit. There was frost on the back steps and steam rising from his coffee mug. But this morning was different, because there were footsteps upstairs, because there were 4 bowls in the drying rack instead of 1, because the house, for the first time, in 3 years didn't feel like it belonged only to ghosts. Jack stood at the stove scrambling eggs when Lily wandered in, her red curls flattened from sleep, dragging the sleeves of a hoodie twice her size. "Is that for me?" she asked, pointing to the eggs. Jack glanced down. "It can be." She slid into a chair at the table, folding her legs under her like a bird nesting. "This house smells like my grandpa's cabin. Wood and something warm." Jack didn't reply, but something in his chest shifted. One by one, the others emerged. Thomas, silent as ever, sat next to Lily and stared at his plate like he was trying to decide if it was safe to believe in breakfast. Joey arrived in Maggie's arms, still half asleep, one sock missing. Jack placed plates in front of each kid, then one in front of Maggie. She hesitated. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," Jack replied. Maggie looked at him for a long second, then sat down. They ate in near silence, save for the clink of forks and the occasional soft cough from Joey. It was Maggie who broke it, quietly between bites. "You don't have to keep us, you know." Jack paused mid-chew. "I mean, I know this isn't permanent, it's just..." She shrugged. "You don't need to act like we're yours." Jack set his fork down. "I'm not." Maggie nodded. "Good." But her voice wobbled. Later, Jack found them in the living room, curled together under the old quilt Ellie had made before she passed. Lily was drawing on the back of a paper grocery bag. Thomas stared at the muted television, like it might speak eventually. Joey was dozing again, thumb in his mouth. He didn't know why he sat down. Maybe because the room felt less heavy with them in it. Maybe because part of him didn't want to go back to fixing things in the shed, or organizing nails in jars, or all the other pointless things he used to do just to pass time he didn't want. "Where'd you all come from?" he asked, not expecting an answer. But Maggie did. "Altoona." "That wasn't far, maybe 2 hours east." "You been on the road long?" She nodded. "Since Tuesday." It was now Friday. He couldn't imagine walking 2 days with 3 siblings. In this cold, in this rain. He didn't want to imagine it. "You always take care of them?" he asked. Maggie shrugged. Somebody had to. Jack stood, walked to the sideboard, and opened a drawer. He pulled out a pack of index cards and a pen. He handed them to Maggie. "Write down your full names, middle too if you know them, and birthdays." She blinked. "Why?" "In case I need it. For school, or a doctor, or anything." Maggie looked at him. "You're gonna register us?" "No," Jack said. "I'm gonna make sure someone can, if it comes to that." She took the pen without another word. One by one, she wrote. Margaret Ann Callahan, born June 12th. Thomas Robert Callahan, born August soon. Lillian May Callahan, born March 19th. Joseph Daniel Callahan, born December 28th. Jack stared at the names, 4 kids. One name, Callahan. He folded the card, placed it in the kitchen drawer, next to a book of matches and an old grocery list Ellie had written years ago. That afternoon, Jack backed his truck out of the driveway and drove them to the market. They needed more than just hand-me-downs. Soap, socks, milk, apples, toilet paper, things that made a house livable. In the produce aisle, Joey reached up and grabbed Jack's hand. Not on purpose, not out of affection. It was reflex, the kind you saw in scared dogs and orphaned animals. But Jack didn't pull away. He let the boy hold his hand all the way to the register. That night, after the kids had eaten and Maggie was folding clean towels like it was second nature, Jack sat on the back porch. Staring at the dark sky, he thought about names, about how a name written on paper made things real, about how 4 kids with one name had ended up in his house, changing the rhythm of his days, unspooling the tight silence he'd wrapped himself in for years. He still didn't know what he was going to do, but he did know this. They had names now, and he had them written down, and that meant something. Jack used to pray, not loudly, not with his hands raised or his voice trembling, but quietly at night, with his head bowed against the mattress, whispering names like promises. Ellie, Sophie, tomorrow. He used to believe that if he kept their names close, nothing could take them away. He was wrong, and when they left, his prayers left with them. Sunday morning arrived like breath on cold glass, quiet, fragile, barely visible. The kids were still sleeping, bundled together like puppies on the living room rug. The couch had become Maggie's spot. Joey had curled up beside her in the night. Lily's arm flopped across Thomas's chest, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. Jack stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window, the mug in his hand long gone cold. He remembered Sunday mornings with pancakes and music playing low from the radio, Sophie dancing barefoot in her pajamas, Ellie humming as she flipped bacon, her hair tied up in that messy knot she always called mama mode. Now the silence was different, not empty, just full of things he didn't know how to say. After breakfast, Jack drove them to the small white church near the edge of town. Not for worship, he hadn't set foot inside in 3 years, but because Mrs. Landry, the pastor's wife, ran a weekly food bank in the basement. He needed groceries, and he needed to ask Pastor Michael a question he hadn't asked anyone in years. The kids fidgeted in the pews while Jack waited by the back wall. He didn't belong here. The wooden floorboards remembered the last time he stood in this room, at Ellie's memorial. The day he'd told God, "You had your shot. We're done." He turned to leave, and stopped when he saw Maggie kneeling at the front, her small hands folded, eyes closed. She wasn't crying. She wasn't whispering anything. She just knelt there, like it was enough to be still. On the drive home, Jack asked, "Do you pray?" Maggie looked out the window. "Sometimes." "Why?" "'Cause it's better than talking to no one." He didn't answer. But her words stayed. That night the house felt heavier. The wind picked up. The temperature dropped. Rain was threatening again, tapping faint warnings on the roof. Jack sat alone at the kitchen table. The kids were tucked in. The fire was dying. Down. His hand drifted to the scar on his arm, the one no one ever asked about. He rubbed it slowly, thumb brushing the ridges like they might give him answers. The scar came from a house fire, one he couldn't forget. It wasn't the blaze that ruined him. It was what it reminded him of, that he'd once failed to protect his own. He had made it out. His captain had pulled him from the flames, half-conscious, coughing up black smoke. The roof had collapsed minutes later. But in Jack's mind, that fire blurred with the hospital room where Sophie had slipped away, the machines beeping softer and softer, Ellie holding their daughter's hand, whispering stories while Jack stood useless in the corner, praying to a God who wasn't listening. He hadn't prayed since, until tonight. It wasn't on his knees. It wasn't with eloquent words. He just sat at the table and whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing, but they're here, and I'm scared to want them to stay." Outside, the wind howled harder. Joey cried in the night, a soft whimper, the kind a child makes when dreams turn cruel. Jack moved without thinking. He crossed the hall, eased down next to the boy, and placed a hand gently on his back. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm here." Joey settled, little by little, curling toward the warmth. In that moment, something shifted, not loudly. Just enough for Jack to feel it in his chest. He didn't know if it was grace or prayer or simply the fragile bloom of hope. But he sat there until the storm passed, in the sky and inside himself. By Tuesday morning, something had changed. Not dramatically. There was no epiphany, no grand gesture, but the house felt different. The air wasn't so heavy. Jack noticed it first in the way the curtains moved. He'd opened the windows to air out the place, and for once, he didn't mind the cold. The sunlight, pale and reluctant, warmed the edge of the kitchen. Counter. Dust danced in the beams. The floor creaked beneath footsteps that weren't his alone. A house doesn't need walls to be empty, he thought. It only takes the absence of laughter. Now, for the first time in years, there was noise again. Not loud, but alive. Lily sang under her breath as she helped Maggie wash dishes. Thomas sat on the porch steps carving a stick with a pocket knife Jack had forgotten he still owned. Joey, ever attached, followed Jack room to room like a duckling that hadn't figured out how to let go. Jack didn't mind. He found himself keeping a second coffee cup on the counter, cooking more than one portion, listening for footsteps. The silence was still there, but now it shared space with the rustling of paper, the thump of toy blocks, the occasional small fight over nothing. He hadn't invited these sounds, but he wasn't ready to lose them either. That morning, while the kids played out back, Maggie found Jack in the shed, where he was trying to fix the broken hinge on the cellar door. She stood just inside the threshold, arms folded. "You were a firefighter?" Jack paused, his hands wrapped around a wrench. "Yeah. You quit?" "I was let go." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Because of the scar?" Jack gave her a long look. "Because of what the scar reminded me of." Maggie nodded like she understood more than she should. Then she said very softly, "You don't look like someone who'd let people down." He didn't know what to do with that. So he went back to the hinge. Later that day, Jack stood at the stove making grilled cheese sandwiches. It wasn't a feast, but it was hot, and it was more than canned beans. Joey sat at the table with a crayon in his fist, drawing squiggly lines that might have been a house or maybe a rocket. Lily added a sun in the corner, her tongue peeking out as she colored. Thomas stared at the toaster as if it might catch fire. Maggie appeared beside Jack without warning. "You want help?" He blinked. "You know how to cook?" "Kind of. I watched my dad. Before?" Jack stepped aside, handed her the spatula. "All right then, let's see what you've got." Together they cooked in silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was a silence that understood something was being built. Not a meal, not really. Something harder to define. When the sandwiches were golden and the tomato soup was ready, they sat down together, 5 around the table. Jack passed bowls like it was normal, like it had always been this way. After lunch, Lily stood on tiptoe and placed her drawing on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a rooster. Jack glanced at it. Is that this house? She nodded proudly. That's you. That's Joey. That's all of us. And that's the tree we're gonna plant. Jack stared at the scribbled brown trunk with red leaves that reached up to the corner of the page. We're planting a tree? Lily giggled. Maggie said every family needs a tree. He looked at Maggie. She shrugged. It's what our dad used to say, she said. He planted one when each of us was born. Said it gave the house roots. Jack swallowed. That night, long after the kids had gone to sleep, he stood alone on the back porch with a shovel in his hands. There, beside the empty spot where Sophie's swing once hung, he dug a small patch of earth. Not for a grave, not for a memory, but for something new. It started with a knock, not the polite kind. Not the kind neighbors use when bringing over pie or asking about fence repairs. This one was sharp, short, angry. Jack froze halfway to the kitchen sink, a dish towel slung over one shoulder. The knock came again, harder. Maggie, seated on the couch reading to Lily, stiffened. Thomas turned toward the door, his face pale. Joey pressed himself into the crook of Maggie's arm. Jack met Maggie's eyes. Her lips barely moved, but the words landed heavy. It's her. Jack opened the door slowly, just enough to see who stood on the porch. A woman. Late 30s, too-thin frame wrapped in a leopard print jacket that didn't suit the chill. Her eyes were lined with exhaustion, mascara smudged at the corners. A man stood behind her. Tall shaved head, arms crossed, impatient. There was something wolfish about the way he leaned forward, as if already daring Jack to push back. Can I help you? Jack asked, voice even. The woman raised her chin. Those kids, they're mine. Jack didn't flinch. They say otherwise. I'm the only adult they've got. I'm their stepmother. You abandoned them. That's a hell of an accusation, the man behind her said. Jack stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him with a soft click. They were left on the side of a road, in the rain. They walked for 2 days. She shrugged, arms folded. You know how hard it is to raise 4 kids that aren't even yours? I didn't sign up for this. But you took the benefits, the checks, the house. Her eyes flicked sideways. She didn't deny it. Jack took a breath. They're safe now. That's all that matters. No, the man said, stepping forward. What matters is what's legal, and legally she's still their guardian. Not for long, Jack said quietly. You hiding? Them here? The woman demanded. What, playing house? Think you can just pretend you're some kind of hero? Jack didn't respond. He just stood there. The man stepped even closer now, eyes hard. Listen, old man. That's when the screen door behind Jack creaked open. Maggie stood in the doorway, pale but steady. They don't want us, she said. They never did. The woman's voice rose. You little brat. Jack moved faster than he thought he could. He stepped between them, one hand gently pushing Maggie back inside, the other held firm like a barrier. You need to leave, he said, steel entering his tone now. You don't get to hurt them again. Or what? The man sneered. You'll call the sheriff? Good luck explaining how you've been harboring runaway kids. Jack didn't blink. Go ahead, please call him. He turned, opened the door wider, and called into the house. Thomas, pick up the phone. By the time Sheriff Harper arrived 20 minutes later, the sun had dipped below the ridge. The sky was bleeding gold into indigo. Wind tugged at the trees like an impatient child. Jack stood on the porch, arms crossed. The kids were inside. The woman and her companion were leaning against their car, faces tight. Harper took in the scene. He knew Jack, had known him for years, knew what he'd lost, and how he'd gone silent afterward. And now here he was, standing between 4 frightened kids and the people who'd left them behind. You've got a mess here, Harper muttered. Jack nodded. But I'm not handing them over. Harper studied him. You willing to sign for temporary custody? Yes. Got enough food? Resources? I'll figure it out. The sheriff glanced back at the woman. She hasn't filed a missing persons report, no legal action taken. And frankly, I don't like the look of that guy with her. Jack didn't speak. Harper sighed. All right, I'll file the paperwork. You'll get a visit from child services, but if the kids want to stay, that'll hold weight. Jack finally exhaled. They do. Behind him, through the cracked door, Maggie's voice rose, soft but sure. We're home. That night, Jack sat on the porch steps long after the sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the road. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, not from adrenaline, from something deeper. He hadn't stood in front of danger like that since. The fire. Not for anyone. Not even himself. But tonight, when Maggie had opened that door, something inside him had sparked to life, primal and absolute. He would protect them, even if it cost him. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and whispered to no one. They're mine now. Jack Mason had stood in front of burning buildings. He'd heard the scream of collapsing beams, felt heat ripple through the air like the breath of something ancient and angry. He'd learned to recognize the line, the exact moment when the danger wasn't just present but personal. He felt it again now, not from fire, but from the storm brewing in his own front yard. It started the next evening. The woman, the one who'd left the children on the side of the road, came back. This time she didn't knock. She just stood there on the lawn, her arms crossed, her voice rising through the wind like a whip crack. I know my rights, she yelled. Jack stepped out onto the porch, the door still ajar behind him. He didn't say anything. Not yet. The man beside her, the one with the shaved head and short fuse, held up his phone. We got people, he said. Lawyers. You think you can just keep them like stray dogs? This ain't over. Jack looked at him, and he didn't flinch. Inside, he could hear the children gathering. Maggie's sharp whisper, Lily's soft whimper, Joey's feet padding nervously on the floor. Jack turned back to the man. His voice was low but steady. You come near them again, and you'll find out exactly how over it is. They didn't leave. Not immediately. The man stepped forward. Jack moved too, without hesitation. No plan. No hesitation. Just instinct. He put his body in the way, not because he wanted to fight, but because he was done running, done letting people walk away with things that mattered. You think they're yours now? The man growled. You think some lonely old fireman gets to play daddy? I'm not playing anything, Jack said, but I'll tell you what I am. He stepped down one stair, his boots landing solid on the wood. I'm the man who opened his door when they had nowhere else to go. Another step. I'm the man who cooked their meals, bandaged their scrapes, sat with them through nightmares. He was standing in front of the man now, the wind blowing through his coat, the porch light behind him throwing his silhouette long and sharp. And I'm the man who won't let you hurt them again. Ever. The man scoffed, tried to move around him. Jack didn't move. He didn't raise his hands, didn't shout. He just stood there, all of him, like a wall someone finally remembered to build. Behind him, the door creaked again. 4 sets of eyes peeked through the gap. Maggie, Thomas, Lily, Joey, watching, waiting. The woman muttered something, too low to catch, then tugged on her partner's arm. Come on, we'll let the courts handle it. They left in a roar of gravel. Jack stayed, exactly where he was until the dust settled. Inside, it was silent. The kids had stepped back, not daring to breathe too loud. Jack walked in slowly, closed the door and locked it. He leaned his back against the wood and exhaled. Maggie was the first to speak. What if they come back? Jack looked at her, and for the first time, really looked. At the way her arms trembled, even though she stood tall. At the way Thomas shifted protectively closer to Lily. At the way Joey clutched a small worn blanket like it might fly away. He crossed the room and crouched beside them. He didn't say, "Don't worry." That would be a lie. He didn't say they won't. That would be a promise he couldn't keep. Instead, he said the only thing that mattered. If they come back, they'll have to get through me. Maggie nodded. Her voice shook when she said it. But she said it anyway. You're not scared? Jack hesitated. Then he shook his head. I am, but I'm more scared of losing you. And that was the truth. He didn't know how it had happened, when survival turned into love, when shelter became home. But it had. Somewhere between a crayon drawing on the fridge and Joey's hand in his, something inside him had cracked open, and he wasn't closing it again. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Jack sat by the fire with a notebook open in his lap. He wrote each of their names again: Maggie, Thomas, Lily, Joey. Then, underneath, for the first time, he wrote Mason. The fire started in the middle of the night. Jack woke to the smell before. He heard the alarm, a strange, sharp smoke that didn't belong to the fireplace or the kitchen. Something acrid. Something wrong. Then came the noise. A crack, a pop, a distant shattering. He was on his feet before he registered moving. Down the hall, Maggie's voice cut through the dark. Jack. He reached the door just as she opened it, her face pale and backlit by the glow of something flickering behind her. Thomas stood barefoot in the hallway, clutching Lily's hand. Joey whimpered, half asleep in Maggie's arms. Get them outside, Jack barked. Now. Maggie didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, her siblings on her heels. Jack raced toward the kitchen. Flames licked up the far wall, dancing around the edges of the old cabinets. The stove. The damn stove. He must have forgotten to turn the knob all the way off after warming milk. He grabbed the extinguisher, yanked the pin and sprayed. Foam, hissing into the flames like anger bottled and released. But it was spreading too fast. Years of dry wood. Old insulation. The fire knew where to go. He dropped the canister and bolted. Outside, the kids stood shivering in the yard, barefoot in the autumn frost, the porch light casting long, trembling shadows. Maggie clutched Joey against her chest. Lily cried silently, hiding her face in Thomas's shoulder. Jack dropped to his knees in front of them. Is everyone okay? He asked, voice hoarse. They nodded. Barely. Stay here, he said. Don't move. But there was nothing to save. The flames were already curling up into the rafters, black smoke rising into the sky like a second night. The kitchen, windows shattered one by one, glowing from within. He watched the house burn. Not as a firefighter, not as a husband, not as a man trying to survive his own grief, but as a father, one who'd just lost the home where love had started to return. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, there wasn't much left to do. They kept the flames from spreading, but the kitchen, the living room, the heart of it, all gone. The rest of the house soaked and scorched, uninhabitable. Jack stood at the edge of the driveway, soaked in sweat and ash, while Harper, the sheriff, approached. You all right? Jack nodded. Harper looked toward the kids wrapped in borrowed blankets in the back of his cruiser. They're lucky, he said. Jack didn't respond. He couldn't speak around the tightness in his throat. At dawn, the house stood quiet. Still, smoldering, skeletal. The front porch had collapsed in on itself. The swing, the one Sophie had once used, was reduced to blackened rope and ash. Jack stood with Maggie beside him, silent. After a long moment, she said, I thought, maybe, we were bad luck. He looked at her. Don't say that. But since we got here, everything's gone wrong. You lost your house. I didn't lose my house, Jack said softly. She looked up at him, confused. He nodded toward the kids sitting under a neighbor's porch awning. That was just a building, he said. They're my home now. Later that morning, a small procession of townspeople began arriving. Mrs. Ellie Lou from the bakery brought warm muffins and a bag of blankets. Pastor Michael offered his church's spare room for the night. The carpenter, Hank, came by with a toolbox and a quiet nod. No one asked questions. No one pried. They just showed up. By noon, Harper had made arrangements for the kids to stay in the church annex until something permanent could be sorted. Jack refused to be separated. "They go where I go," he said. "If you need me to sleep on the floor, I will." Harper looked at him for a long time, then handed him the keys. That night, Jack sat on a cot with Joey asleep on his chest. The boy breathed slow and steady. Little fingers curled into the fabric of Jack's shirt like roots gripping earth. Jack looked around the annex, cinder block walls, a flickering lamp, 4 cots in a row. It wasn't home. Not yet. But maybe home. Wasn't a place, maybe it was a promise. It began with hammers. Not loud. Not rushed. Just steady, rhythmic, like a second heartbeat rising out of the ashes. Jack stood at the edge of the scorched lot, boots crunching over brittle, blackened debris, watching as Hank Reynolds, the town carpenter, measured out a fresh board and nodded to his apprentice to cut it clean. Behind them, Pastor Michael was hauling beams off a flatbed truck, sleeves rolled, his quiet strength speaking louder than any sermon Jack had ever heard. "Where do you want the frame line?" Hank called. Jack hesitated. He'd never planned to rebuild, not really. But now, he stepped forward and pointed. "Start it here. The kitchen window should catch the morning sun." Hank tipped his cap. "Then let's give it the best seat in the house." In the days after the fire, something remarkable happened. Word spread, and Willow Hollow responded. People Jack hadn't spoken to in years showed up. No questions, just tools and thermoses of coffee. Mrs. Ellie Lou brought pies every morning. The high school shop class volunteered to help frame the new porch. Sheriff Harper paid out of pocket for insulation. Even the kids pitched in. Thomas sanded boards, brow furrowed with the quiet focus of someone twice his age. Maggie helped Hank keep track of tools and measurements. Lily painted scraps of wood with wild colors and called them dream signs. Joey mostly wandered and giggled, but Jack swore the boy had an instinct for finding lost nails. It was chaos. It was imperfect. But it was home, slowly rising from the ruin. Jack spent most of his time between the build site and the church annex, where the kids still slept each night. It wasn't ideal, 4 cots crammed in a room with fluorescent lights and paper-thin walls, but it was safe. And somehow, it had started to feel right. One night, Maggie found him sitting on the floor outside the annex kitchen, nursing, a sore shoulder and sipping lukewarm coffee. "You ever think this would happen?" she asked, sitting beside him. He shook his head. "Not in a million years." "Me neither." She was quiet a moment, then added, "When we first got here, I thought we were just passing through, like everywhere else. I didn't think anyone would want us." Jack stared at the far wall. "I didn't think I had anything left to give." They sat in silence. Then Maggie asked the question he hadn't known he needed to hear. "Do you want us to stay?" He turned to her, met her eyes, and said softly, honestly, "More than anything." By the second week, the frame of the house stood tall. Lily made a little sign that read Mason Family Home and nailed it crooked above the front step. Jack left it there, off-center and perfect. One afternoon, a woman from Child Services came by, young, efficient, clipboard in hand. She spoke with Jack, asked the kids a few questions, inspected the sleeping cots at the church. Afterward, she sat across from Jack in the makeshift kitchen and folded her hands. "They want to stay," she said. "I know," Jack replied. "And you want them." "I do." She paused. "This isn't foster care. This would be guardianship. Long-term. Potentially permanent." "I understand." She studied him. "You live alone. You've experienced loss. You're not the standard candidate." "I'm also not walking away." She held his gaze a beat, longer. Then she nodded. "All right, we'll begin the paperwork." That night, the kids helped him mark where the garden would go, the spot behind the house. The same patch of earth where Sophie's swing had once hung. Now it would grow tomatoes, maybe some carrots, and a tree. A single sapling, waiting to be planted. The beginning of something that would need time, and sunlight, and care. Jack looked around at the children, his children, laughing as they measured rows with sticks and string, and for the first time in years he smiled without feeling like it might break him. The sky was clear that morning, crisp and blue, the kind of October light that made even sorrow feel softened, like it had been worn down by wind and time. Jack Mason stood in the backyard of the house that now stood on the same footprint where the fire had burned everything down. But this place, it wasn't a replica, it was better. The porch steps creaked with fresh wood. The kitchen smelled faintly of pine and warm bread. There were scratches in the door frame where Joey had started measuring how tall he was. Lily had taped her latest drawing, a house with 5 stick figures and 1 bright red tree, onto the fridge. Maggie was in the kitchen packing school lunches. Thomas was out front organizing tools for the day's planting. Joey was bouncing, in his socks near the back door, already asking for snacks. Again, everything was ordinary, which, for Jack, meant it was nothing short of holy. He stepped outside, hands tucked into his jacket, and looked down at the young sapling in the wagon beside him, a sugar maple, picked out by the kids, paid for with what was left from donations. It was about 5 feet tall, barely thicker than his wrist, with roots bundled in burlap and a tag that read, "Plant where the sun can find it." He smiled at that. Maggie came out first, holding the shovel. "I thought this was your job," she teased. Jack nodded toward the tree. "It is, but we plant it together." Thomas followed, holding the bucket of water. Lily danced behind them, carrying a mason jar full of acorns, her contribution. Joey trailed close to Jack, clutching his stuffed bear in one hand and Jack's pant leg with the other. They gathered at the far end of the yard, the same spot where Sophie's swing had once been. The ground was soft from last night's rain, ready to hold something new. Jack placed his hand on the shovel, then looked at Maggie. "Want to start?" She dug the first slice into the earth, then Thomas, then Lily, then Jack, and finally Joey, who tossed a handful of dirt and acorns into the hole with great ceremony and no aim at all. When the tree was steady in its place, Jack knelt to tie the support stakes. His hands were rough and cracked but steady, the way they used to be when he built furniture with Ellie, when he'd rocked Sophie to sleep. Now they were building something else, not out of nails or timber, but out of love and fear and something braver than both. He looked up at the kids. "This tree," he said, voice low but strong, "is a promise." They leaned in, listening. "It won't grow fast, and we'll have to take care of it. But if we do, it'll be here long after we're gone." Joey tugged his sleeve. "Even when I'm big?" Jack nodded. "Even then." Maggie knelt beside him. "What kind of promise?" He thought for a moment, then answered, slowly, like the words needed time to find their place. "That we chose each other, that we stayed, and that we grew something out of what tried to break us." The sun rose higher. They watered the tree. Lily hung her mason jar of acorns on a branch. "For luck," she said. Thomas hammered a tiny wooden plaque into the soil that read, "Promise Tree, planted by the Mason family." Maggie, quiet as always, simply stood there, watching Jack with an expression he didn't yet have words for. But later that night, after the dishes were washed and the house was dim and soft, she found him at the back door. He sat with a blanket. Across his lap, coffee in hand, the tree visible through the window, just a slender shadow in the moonlight. Maggie stood beside him, hands in her sweatshirt sleeves. "You know," she said, "we don't expect forever." Jack looked up at her. "We just hope you keep choosing us every day." He reached out. She took his hand. And in the hush of that moment, that porch, that fall night thick with quiet promise, Jack finally said what he'd been holding back since the beginning. "I will." Not a vow, not a contract, just a decision. The kind you make, with your whole self, the kind you renew every day. A house can be rebuilt. So can a heart. And sometimes, all it takes is one quiet promise. We don't promise forever, but today we choose to stay. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe for more journeys of healing, hope, and home.